Welcome to this meeting of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. As the subject of today's lecture is Islam, it would be callous not to note that relations between Islamic communities and others are currently being severely tested by the renewed and extreme violence between Hamas and Israel. The repercussions are only just beginning to be felt, and although today's talk is not directly concerned with the events in and around Gaza, those events are already having a profound impact on community relations around the world. We're very fortunate today to have as our speaker Professor Adeeb Khalid, who has made the Islamic populations of Central Asia and their relationships to state authority the center of his research for many decades. Professor Khalid is the Jing and Raphael Bernstein Professor of Asian Studies and History at Carleton College, Minnesota, from where he joins us online. Professor Khalid's work centers on the history of the sedentary societies of Central Asia from the time of the Russian conquest to the present, and he has held visiting appointments at the John W. Kluger Center for Scholars at the Library of Congress and at the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme in Paris, and is a member of the editorial boards of Slavic Review, Central Asian Survey, and Cahiers de l'Asie Centrale. His most recent book is Central Asia, New History from the Imperial Conquests to the Present, and you will shortly find a link to the book in the chat channel. Please welcome him. Professor Adeeb, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be speaking to the Royal Society of Asian Affairs. When I started my when I first got interested in Central Asia many decades ago, the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society was one of the first sources of scholarship that I ever encountered on the region. So I think this it has come full circle now. What I would like to talk about is the course that Islam and Islamic expression has taken in Central Asia in the modern age. And Central Asia is, by which I mean, let me share my screen here. So this is the region that I have in mind when I speak of Central Asia. These are the 5 states in the region that were, until 1991, parts of the Soviet Union. And it is that Soviet experience that has had a remarkable influence on the way the people in these societies relate to Islam. Central Asia has long been part of the heartland of the Islamic world, yet its history since 1917 has meant a substantial departure, a substantial rupture, and in many ways a divergence from other Muslim societies. So I want to start with a couple of very basic points about Islam itself. I think there are, we can talk about different ways of understanding Islam. There are essentialist understandings that see in Islam a certain essence that is immutable and unchangeable, that does not is not subject to historical change. And a lot of statements we make about Islam sort of go back to that understanding. I counterpose to that a historicist understanding of Islam, in which Islam is not stable or homogeneous or monolithic, but it takes many shapes and many forms depending on the conditions in which Muslims find themselves. Islam is also, like all religions, internally plural, that the same sources of authority can lead to multiple interpretations and multiple understandings that are often in contestation and conflict with each other. and that these internal disagreements about what it means to be a Muslim and what it is the proper way of being understanding Islam are absolutely central to the experience that Muslims have of Islam. And finally, that yes, these sources of the Quran, the traditions of the Prophet, but also many other sources of authority are all open to multiple interpretations and multiple understandings. And the contestation over this is absolutely central. And so Islam is not a single monolithic thing, but think of it as a moving target. All right, we'll come to that. Sorry, maybe we should go back. So it was here that it is through this lens that we can sort of get into understanding the transformations that Islam experienced under Soviet rule. The Bolsheviks took power in 1917, though it was many years before their power was anywhere near stable in Central Asia. And they had their own understanding of the place of religion in society. Number one was a vision of a utopian remaking of the world and of the human individual in it, in which the world would be fully rational and there would be no need for any supernatural explanations of the world. And I think that is, and this is something that comes out of the radical Enlightenment. It is a radical position about religion as a whole that lies at the very bosom of a certain tradition of the radical Enlightenment, the very bosom of Western thought. The Bolsheviks, being good Marxists, saw religion as an ideological cloak for exploitation, but they were also afraid of the power of religion to organize opposition to the Soviet regime that the Bolsheviks were putting in place. So ideally, a proper communist society would have no religion in it. Meanwhile, in Central Asia, this was a period of substantial weakness of Soviet rule. The Soviets, much like their Tsarist imperial predecessors, were afraid of the fanaticism of the local population. So for the first 10 years, Central Asia was spared the full extent of Soviet anti-religious policies that were being implemented in Russia itself from the very outset. But this was also a period of substantial religious ferment in Central Asia. There was a movement of modernist reform among Muslim intellectuals that was often very critical of existing religious elites there, and these Muslim modernists had borrowed quite wholesale from sort of contemporary European anti-clericalism, in which they used then to make to criticize the authority of conservative Muslim elites. And this found some resonance with the Bolshevik critiques of religion, of Islam. Here's a cartoon from 1924 from a satirical magazine published in Uzbek, where I think the top frame is the old school that turns people into into donkeys and animals, as opposed to the new school that in the bottom frame that properly educates the children into useful and productive citizens. Here is another early Soviet cartoon that in the first frame, which is on the right, religion is really being a cloak for exploitation. This poor farmer is being led astray and exploited. In the second frame, the Enlightenment has meant the dismissal of religion here. These tractors in the bottom, they are the most fundamental Soviet tropes of modernity. But overthrowing religion is a way of, or at least overthrowing the authority of old-style religious elites is a prerequisite here for enlightenment and liberation. One final cartoon, again published in Uzbek and drawn by an Uzbek artist. A clear example of anti-clericalism. An old-style religious figure has arrived from Namangan into Tashkent, and they are all turned into animals. So this, I would say, is still a Islamic modernist critique of traditional Islam that we see in this first decade of Soviet rule. All of this goes out of the window when the Soviets decide in 1927 that their power is stable enough in Central Asia that they can actually go to a different kind of religious policy. And here we have, beginning in 1927, a major campaign against Islam in Central Asia. In many ways, it shared features of Soviet anti-religious policies that had been in action in Russia since 1918. This meant basically the destruction of the religious infrastructure of Islam. In simpler words, mosques were shut down in some ways and sometimes destroyed. Shrines were shut down or destroyed or put to other uses. Some mosques could be turned into warehouses, stores, shops. In one case, a stable for police horses. Later on, a lot of them were housed museums of atheism. Islamic courts also were abolished, and the pious endowments, the Waqf, were all confiscated by the state. So and this happens basically, there's a first wave between 1927 and 1932, and then there are other versions as well. The result was that Islam was largely disestablished. The authority of older Islamic elites was abolished, and Islamic education disappeared. Or the only way any Islamic knowledge could be transmitted was in the family. And the public space, the space outside of the home, was not just neutral or secular, but actually anti-religious, where constant messages about the harm that religion causes, that Islam causes, were widespread. And here is an example of sort of this triumphalist anti-Islamic messaging that was common in the 1930s. Here we have two women liberated by the red flag, marching forward, while in this corner, older elites are crouching in fear. In the background, a crowd is assaulting a mosque, and the red flag and the tractor, which again is the a symbol of Soviet modernity, is marching. So this campaign that lasted up until the outbreak of the Second World War is, I would argue, a major rupture in Central Asian Islamic history, and something that really set Central Asia and other Soviet Muslim societies such as Azerbaijan and Tatarstan on a different trajectory from the rest of the Muslim world, where very few other societies saw a destruction of Islam in quite this way. There are other examples we can think of. Albania, parts of Yugoslavia, and then the Muslim societies of China in Eastern Turkestan, the Uyghur homeland, where we witness similar campaigns. In the Uyghur homeland, actually, unfortunately, something very similar is going on right now as we speak. But I cannot emphasize enough the significance of this destruction of Islamic infrastructure in Soviet Central Asia. The destruction sort of stopped after 1941, once the war began. Once the Soviet Union was pulled into the Second World War, the state made its peace more or less with religion, and these assaults on Islam and Islamic figures stopped. But the destruction was never undone. There was no wave of reopening of mosques or of, let alone any reconstruction. For the rest of the Soviet period, the Central Asian landscape was dotted with mosques in ruins or mosques with padlocks on it. Islamic education was not available. There was no Islamic publishing, and there were very few contacts with the outside world. But in 1943, the Soviet state, as part of its peace with religion, was the establishment of a number of spiritual administrations. There ended up being 4 of them, one for different parts of the Soviet Union. They picked up on a institutional structure that the Tsarist Empire had established. The spiritual administration in Ufa, which is now in Bashkortostan, had existed since 1788. Where the Tsarist state had created this spiritual administration. That had never been extended to Central Asia. So the spiritual administration that was housed in Tashkent was brand new, the first attempt in the history of Central Asian Islam by a state to establish an administrative structure for Islam. So what did these administrations do? They were a mechanism both of control and a space for the existence of some officially recognized Islamic practice. They were run by Islamic scholars themselves, but they operated within very limited spheres of competence. In 1985, when Gorbachev came to power and set in motion his reform of the Soviet state, and when things began to change, in 1985, there were an estimated a total of about 180 mosques in the entire Soviet Union. So these spiritual administrations were both a mechanism of control and permission. But again, I think we should not fool ourselves into thinking that their existence made a very big difference. The public space, the Soviet public space, remained hostile to religion, though the kind of violence that we saw in the 1930s was not repeated. But nevertheless, what we have is still a political landscape that is radically different from anywhere else in the Muslim world. Of course, the so-called official Islam was not the totality of it. A lot of Islamic practice existed outside of these official institutions. And again, Islam does not require any collective action. All Muslims, as I like to say, are ritually independent. You can fulfill all your rituals entirely by yourself at home. And so the majority of Islamic practice remained beyond the purview of these official directorates. There were unofficial mosques. There were a few instances from the 1960s on of people imparting religious education in private, in secret. In the West, this unofficial Islam was invested with great political significance. We thought that this was a source of opposition to the Soviet state. And I think now that we've sort of had access to what sources of what was going on at that time, I think it's quite clear that these hopes and the significance was vastly overstated. What you have, actually, there's plenty of evidence that the relationships of unofficial Islam with the official directorates were not hostile. Official directorates often saw themselves as being in a place to help the other unofficial Muslims. But ultimately, there was no major conflict there. And this unofficial Islam was largely, almost entirely apolitical. The concern there was with conserving practice, conserving knowledge, rather than taking on the state. And while I've been focusing on the destruction and the negatives, the Soviet period was also immensely productive in other ways. And it cultivated sort of national identities, as in there was a sense of a pan-Soviet collective identity that did exist, but the Soviets had, from the very beginning, adopted a set of policies that we sort of call nationalities, policy that recognized that the Soviet Union was a multinational space in which many different nationalities lived together in a deep friendship. And that each nation of inside the Soviet Union, such as the Uzbeks and the Kazakhs and the Tajiks, or the Ukrainians and the Belarusians, were free to celebrate their national identity and their national culture, which the Soviet regime saw as completely legitimate as long as it kept within Soviet limits, did not lead to claims against one another or against the Russians, and as long as it remained largely apolitical. And here, the guardians of the nation, the people of these national identities, were the humanities intelligentsia ensconced in Soviet institutions themselves. Professors of history, of ethnography, of folklore, of literature, these people were all employed in very large numbers in Soviet universities and research institutions, the academies of sciences, and they saw themselves very much as the guardians of their nation. These national identities had been emerging at the time of the revolution, so they are not, concocted by the Soviets, but Soviet institutions, Soviet funding actually did a lot to crystallize these new national identities. And so here, I think Islam and nation and Sovietness all coexisted in the Soviet period. That to be an Uzbek meant to be a Muslim, but it was also connected to being Soviet. Islam in many ways became localized, that there was very little travel, very little contact with the outside world in the most of the Soviet period. And so Islam in significant ways became localized and was rendered synonymous in the eyes of most Central Asian Muslims with their cultural traditions. It became a form of communal identity that was not necessarily connected to religious injunctions. So you could say the consumption of vodka became very commonplace, especially among men. And that had nothing to do with this communal identity, that even ways of drinking vodka could become nationalized in this way. And so what we have, and Islam then became subjugated to discourses of national identity, that to be an Uzbek required being a Muslim, but being a Muslim was also a part of one's Uzbekness, say. And finally, so I think we can talk about this conjunction of influences as a certain kind of a Soviet Islam, that where being Muslim was not counterposed to being Soviet. Islam was largely apolitical, and ultimately you can think of this as a different vision of Muslim modernity, that of being Muslim and modern at the same time than you have elsewhere in the Muslim world. And so for the implications of all of that are that nation, state, and Islam cohabited easily. Islam was pushed out of the public realm. You could not make any claims on the basis of Islam or Islamic morality. The only language permissible for those was that of Soviet socialism. And those continuities are still pretty strong. And that's what I'd like to talk about in the rest of this talk, the few minutes that I have left. But again, I think the key point is that understandings of Islam, of what we think we know about Islam in, say, Afghanistan or Iran or Egypt, cannot be transplanted to Central Asia without keeping in mind its very peculiar modern history. So after the Soviets, what we have are these 5 sovereign states that are, we can think of them as nationalizing states. They act in the name of the nation after which they are named. So Kazakhstan is the national state of the Kazakhs, Tajikistan for the Tajiks, and so on and so forth. They all use history to legitimize the state. They're all self-consciously secular, and the continuities with Soviet institutional arrangements in managing Islam are still in place. So let me show you how some of this works. Here is the central square in Tashkent in Uzbekistan is adorned with this statue of Tamerlane, Amir, who's known as Amir Timur in Uzbekistan, who's sort of the founding figure of the modern Uzbek nation, a place that that Uzbek intellectuals had come to see him as the font of Uzbekness even before the Russian Revolution. And now he is the father of the nation in Tajikistan, in Turkmenistan. The first president labeled himself the Turkmenbashi, the head Turkmen, and built a cult of personality around himself. In Tajikistan, the equivalent of Amir Timur is Ismail Samani, the founder of the Samanid dynasty, which modern Tajik intellectuals see as the fountainhead of the Tajik nation and of Tajik national identity. Here is a statue of him. This is in Khujand in the north of the country. Here's another one in Tajikistan, in Dushanbe. And in Astana, here we have where the state built a brand new capital with spectacular architecture. This is the tower that, again, comes from Kazakh folklore and is meant to represent the aspirations of a modern Kazakh nation. In all of that, Islam, so the history that legitimizes the modern states does not have a very central place for Islam. Islam ends up being part of a national cultural heritage of each nation's contribution to the global treasure house to the treasury of global culture. And so here, all these states make a clear distinction between sort of the right kind of Islam that is part of national heritage and the wrong kind of Islam that is political, that is influenced by outsiders, and that is politically unreliable. So, and to do that, all these states use basically descendants of the spiritual administrations of the Soviet period. The Soviet administrations are gone, but they were all replaced by national equivalent. So each of those 5 states has a spiritual administration under various names that still mark a very direct continuity with the Soviet past. So I will begin to conclude now. I would say that understanding Islam in Central Asia today, without taking into account the experience of the Soviet period with this massive destruction and this massive disestablishment of Islam, is impossible. And it is that experience that marks modern Central Asia as different from most other parts of the Muslim world, where that kind of destruction and disestablishment never really happened. There have been other radically secularizing regimes in the Muslim world, but with the possible exception, with the exception of Albania and parts of Yugoslavia, and China and the Muslim communities of China, you don't really have any other example of this kind of an experience of modern history. And that, I think, explains how Central Asian states behave and how most Central Asian citizens also act. So I'll stop here, and hopefully there will be some questions. I will be very happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Khalid. I mean, if members of our audience would like to ask questions, please use the Q&A button on your screen and we will do our best to answer them. Can I start, though, with a question of my own? And this is really about the extent to which contemporary governments in Central Asia how contemporary governments in Central Asia see their international political position. And I'm prompted on this by the fact that, as most viewers will know, the United States, the UK, and most other Western-oriented countries were very quick to publicly endorse Israel's right to respond to the Hamas attacks of 7 October. And however sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, there can be few governments in the world that would not at least privately take the same position. A state's ability to protect its citizens is an existential one. But the Israel-Palestine conflict is more complex, perhaps, than any other in the world, and Central Asian governments' statements have been cautious, nuanced, avoiding anything that could be characterized as partisan. Could you say a little bit about that?
So, again, I think what I was saying about how Central Asian states see themselves explains quite a bit of that they are self-consciously secular. They all have relations with Israel and embassies and all of that, and they are all quite phobic of radical Islamic movements. At the same time, their take on, the populations are overwhelmingly Muslim, and there is a great deal of sympathy for the plight of the Palestinians among all Muslims in the world. That is an undeniable fact. So it would not have, I would not have expected those states to have anything less cautious than what they have put out. Their own, I don't think there's any great sympathy for Israel among the populations of those states, and much as these states are often happy to take authoritarian positions over the wishes of their populations, this would not really have been, I would not have expected anything more than that.
And I'm sure you're right in that. A simple factual question from one of our viewers: did the Soviet Union allow Muslims to go on the Hajj?
Yes, but in very small numbers. So, in the 1920s, it was the borders were more or less open, though there was other kinds of chaos. And then the Hajj was largely banned until 1947, when the Soviets began to allow basically highly vetted small numbers of highly vetted people to go. The numbers were between 45 and 55 every year. At a time when, say, Turkey or Pakistan would send 90,000 people, there was a Soviet delegation of about 45.
Yeah, it's perhaps surprising that even the 45 were allowed to go.
And it was the spiritual administrations were the mechanism through which people could apply, and then they were vetted before they went, and they were debriefed after they returned. But yeah.
A different sort of question from another viewer. Could you, she asks, could you speculate about how pre-Islamic religions already present in Central Asia when Islam arrived have influenced the way in which Islam developed in Central Asia?
So, yes, I mean, there's a great deal of writing on that. The Soviets like to call it survivals, the survivals of the past that were incorporated into Islam. And you can see there are all sorts of practices that we can trace back to pre-Islamic survivals. But I think, so Islam, as I was saying at the beginning, is not monolithic. Not everyone acts alike. And there's a great deal of debate among Muslims of what is permissible, what is not permissible, what is orthodox, what is not. And so there are all sorts of practices in which older customs and traditions were incorporated into everyday Islam. But I think most people gave them a completely Islamic meaning. And they did not, even when you do, perform these rituals or ceremonies, most Muslims would not have thought that they are doing something pre-Islamic. That was rendered completely Islamic. But yes, in everyday practices, there is a huge variety of phenomena that can be traced back to older traditions.
That's a sort of process of assimilation that one sees elsewhere. Of course,
Right.
famously, Christmas is celebrated on the anniversary of a Roman holiday.
No, exactly.
One of our members has asked if there was any Ottoman influence still identifiable in Central Asia. Did the Turkic connections have any consequences?
Okay, and that's an excellent question. Up until the late 19th century, there was very little Ottoman connection. The fact that the Ottomans themselves saw the state really did not see itself as primarily a Turkic state. It was a dynastic state. And the distances were huge. And so up until the late 19th century, there was not a whole lot of Ottoman influence. But then between the Ottomans trying to project some influence, especially under the last Sultan, Abdul Hamid, and the arrival of printing and newspapers and steamships and railways that could transport them, you have basically the emergence of a single sort of public space in Turkic language newspapers that encompass both the Russian and the Ottoman empires. And that's where there was a lot of back and forth, and the whole idea of Turkism, just not the same as pan-Turkism, but that our Turkic origins are of significance and should sort of affect how we think about identity and community. That Turkism sort of developed in this public space that encompassed both of these empires. And it was through that around the turn of the 20th century, we can see a lot of Ottoman ideas floating around in Central Asia. And I think the line of argument that makes Timur the father of the Uzbek nation, how Uzbek identity was imagined at that time, had a lot to do with these Turkic ideas floating around between those two empires. Whether the Ottomans as an empire had any military or political influence, I would say no. So the influence was at the level of these ideas that in a common public space, rather than any Ottoman military might doing anything significant.
Very interesting indeed. Thank you. going back to the if you like the sort of the flavor of Islam in different parts of Asia. We have a question. Do you think that today's strength of Islam in the various Central Asian countries has been influenced by the varying ethnic compositions of those states? So has, for example, Islam in Turkmenistan, which is a highly homogeneous population, developed differently compared to a much more multi-ethnic state such as Kazakhstan?
I think broadly speaking, yes. I would say that, and Central Asians themselves would say that, oh, I've heard statements such as, we are Turkmens, we have a different attitude towards Islam than those Uzbeks who are much more fanatical, or so on and so forth. So, and we should not take that statement completely at face value, but the fact that today Central Asians do think in these national terms, and they associate different attitudes with different nationalities. Having said that, I should also say that one of the features of the post-Soviet period of the last 30 years now is, the communication with the rest of the world is much more open, and there has been a return of Islamic piety, and there is across all those 5 states, there's also a stratum of people who actually try to fashion themselves into moral, properly Islamic beings. And that many of them would sort of reject purely cultural forms of Islam and aspire to more sort of proper orthodox, of what they see as orthodox behavior that in many ways they see as universal and not nationally defined. So if I'm not sure if I answered the question quite the way it was posed, but I think there are multiple processes going on, and this idea of a sort of a proper way of being Muslim is also out there.
Thank you. Just going back a little bit to the Soviet era, and 2 or 3 questions here. One viewer asks if you could clarify what you meant when you referred to religion as an ideological cloak for exploitation. I think this was in the context of Marxist views of religion as some kind of false consciousness. So perhaps you could say definitively.
Yeah. Right. So I was talking about the roots of, why the Soviets did what they did, how they saw religion. And that goes straight back to Marx, that for him, the famous quote that religion is the opiate of the masses. And the term there is opiate, not opium. It's a salve that dulls the pain, and that powers then use religion to hide the fact that there is exploitation in society by giving people, this is what Marx is saying, not me. This is the basic Marxist view that, and that ultimately once exploitation goes away, then the need to hide it will go away, and there'll be no religion.
Thank you. I'm going to we're getting quite a lot of questions, so I'm going to try and combine 1 or 2 of them where they seem to me to overlap a little.
Mm-hmm.
Have Central Asian states which are majority Shia been much influenced by Khomeinism and religious thinking in Iran? And I mean, in the historical context, this is returning to the Soviet era, was there any difference in the treatment by the Soviet authorities of Sunni Islam and minority branches like the Nizari Ismaili in the Tajik Pamirs.
Okay, so the short answer is no, that the Soviets treated all Muslims, basically all religions, and really identically. There was the Pamiri population was different in the sense that it's small and it lived in inaccessible places. The Soviets did think that they were less likely to cause trouble. And so, but again, I think the lack of repression there had as much to do with there not being very much existing infrastructure to repress. What in the 1920s the Soviets were worried about was the Ismaili Pamiris' connection to the Aga Khan, and who lived outside of the Soviet Union and had actually taken quite anti-Soviet positions in some ways. So those links were dismantled, but beyond that, the other Shi'i population in the Soviet Union, the one major Shi'i population is in Azerbaijan, actually, and which is, I think, 2/3 of the Muslims in Azerbaijan are Shia. And there has not been a whole lot of receptivity to Khomeini or the Islamic Revolution. I think the Azerbaijani, since most people in Azerbaijan really are not that deeply invested in Islamic practice, and therefore the idea that the Islamic Revolution in Iran would have a lot of resonance there does not seem, has not transpired. And if anything, that Iran's relationships with Central Asia and with Azerbaijan have been largely quite, they've emphasized national security and trade. And then in the case of Tajikistan, which is Persian speaking, cultural links. With Azerbaijan, Iran's relationship has been quite rocky. Actually, and Iran today gets along much better with Armenia than with Azerbaijan, despite the common Islamic connection, or the Shia connection, seems to have had very little influence on how Iran and Azerbaijan interact.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Drawing on another question here relating to the influence of other Islamic states, could you say a word or two about the extent to which Afghanistan has had an impact? I mean, clearly there's been a geostrategic impact, but I've never had the sense myself that the brand of Islam that the Taliban has promoted, for example, has had any traction in the neighboring Central Asian countries. But perhaps I'm mistaken about that.
Oh, during the Soviet period, there was really the Soviet boundary, international boundary, was quite porous, and you basically don't have a whole lot of outside. I mean, that's what I meant by Islam being localized, that in the Soviet period, Soviet Muslims were largely cut off from outside influences. So the rise of the kind of political Islam that we see with the Muslim Brotherhood or Maududi in Pakistan, that largely passed by the Soviet Muslims. That was just, their concerns were quite different. Since the late 1980s, that's when the Soviet Union began to open up during the Gorbachev period. There's been a lot more of this back and forth, and links have been built with the rest of the Muslim world, and all kinds of different Islamic trends and ideologies have appeared in Central Asia. The Taliban, of course, themselves were a product of the war that now has been going on for 45 years in Afghanistan. And it was that war that in many ways created new ways of relating to Islam and the kind of the understanding of what jihad is, and that is purely a military phenomenon. All of that really is a product of the disintegration of Afghanistan as a society as a result of the war that was started by the Soviet intervention and in 1979, then joined in by Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and all of that has created the Taliban. Whether that can be transplanted to Central Asia, I would say that today, among Central Asians, there is not a whole lot of sympathy for that expression of Islam, which is not to say that there are not small numbers of people prone to that, but generally speaking, that it's Central Asia's own history of Islam that where the Soviet period, I would say, still has quite a bit of relevance to how Central Asians today relate to Islam.
Just turning to the small pockets of Islamic fundamentalism that have appeared in Central Asia. I mean, the Fergana Valley was a source of concern a few years ago. Russia, of course, used the United States rhetoric about 9/11 and the war on terror, as did Israel, in fact, as a justification for its own policies and a way of trying to, if you like, sort of protect its own actions against Western criticism, because it could put itself in this same language. But to what extent, I mean, first of all, have those kinds of responses been adopted by the governments of Central Asian countries themselves? And how far is Saudi investment a factor in some of the emergence of more extreme variants of Islam?
Well, yes, the rhetoric of sort of the global war on terror, of anti-terrorism, I think we have that is out and about all over the world, actually. And I think the other place where is in the Uyghur homeland in Xinjiang, where the Chinese state has very purposefully adopted that rhetoric up until 2001. I think the idea that disaffected Uyghurs were accused of pan-Turkism, of other kinds of nationalism. Since 9/11, the Chinese state has just called all Uyghurs who do not toe the line, religious extremists, and so on and so forth. And in Central Asia, that was very much the case, especially in Uzbekistan, where between especially between 1998 and 2010, for about 12 years, the state was quite implacably opposed to any expressions of Islam that it did not approve of. And it used the rhetoric of anti-terrorism as a pretty heavy cudgel to, to prosecute anyone who it saw as acting outside very narrowly confined, very narrowly defined parameters of Islamic observance. So that was the most explicit example of that use of that rhetoric. But I would say that generally speaking, the idea that the basic idea that certain expressions of Islam that are violent or militant or fundamentalist are completely beyond the pale in Central Asia, for Central Asian states. And they decide where the line is. And they often decided, err on the side of, generosity in defining, they define the limits of the impermissible quite generously. That's what I meant by generosity, not generous to Islamic fundamentalists. So yes, the rhetoric of the war on terror is very much there. Saudi investment, I'm not sure there's a direct link to any of that. There is substantial investment also from the Gulf, from the UAE and Kuwait, but I am not sure if that has produced quite the same kind of effect that it has in other places. In Pakistan, Saudi influences have been much more prevalent, much more subversive of other forms of Islamic expression. I don't think there is quite the analog there in Central Asia. The key there actually has been Turkish investments that have really changed Central Asia in significant ways. And the Turkish presence is much greater than any Saudi or Emirati presence in Central Asia. And most of the people in Turkey who have sort of gone into Central Asia are not the hardcore Kemalists, but the new Muslim Turkish bourgeoisie that has arisen, that is behind the rise of the AKP. So, which is all very interesting, because I remember in 1991 and 92, when the Soviet Union was falling apart, a lot of the discussion in the West was whether Central Asia will follow the Iranian model or the Turkish model. And the Iranian model was that of the Khomeini-style revolution, and the Turkish model was the Kemalist secularism. Well, what has happened in the 30 plus years since then is that the Iranians have had really no ideological, they have not even tried to export their revolution. Their relations have been really quite matter-of-fact national security, economic cooperation of that. And the Turkish link has been not the Kemalist secularism, but the Turkish Muslim bourgeoisie that has built mosques and established Muslim schools, the Fethullah Gülen movement that Erdogan was best friends with until he turned on them in 2016. The Gülen movement had hundreds of schools in Central Asia. So I think the return to Islam has been facilitated by Turkish investments much more than anything else.
That's a fascinating reflection, and it's clear we could go on for quite a lot longer, but Professor Khalid, you've been extremely generous with your time. and we ought to let you go. I'd just say to the audience, if you would like to revisit any of today's talk, a recording of it will be available on the RSAA YouTube channel within the next couple of days, and a transcript will also be available through our website. Our next event will be on the 15th of November, when Christoph Baumer will be talking about the Caucasus during the First and Second World Wars. For those who are in or near London, you can attend the event in person, and for those who live too far away, the talk will be also online, so I hope you will join us then. For now, I would just like to thank Professor Khalid for an absolutely fascinating talk that's left us with a great deal to think about, and to thank our audience for joining us today. Thank you and goodbye.